always a very sophisticated calculation that has to go into whether you do sue for defamation, what your likely prospects are, and what you're willing to pay for it. Thomas Jefferson himself once wrote in 1787 to Edward Carrington, "If I could have government without newspapers, or newspapers without government, I wouldn't hesitate a moment to pick the latter." And working out old, analog, pre-digital legal principles and rules to fit our new media ecology is going to be one of the most difficult challenges, I think, in the 21st century.
You're listening to Doing Time, Talking Crime, a podcast that showcases the work being conducted at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Crime, Security and Law in Freiburg, Germany. My name is Christopher Murphy, and I'll be talking to researchers from the fields of criminology, psychology and law. All this and more on Doing Time, Talking Crime. Well, welcome back to Doing Time, Talking Crime. As always, it's great to have you here with us today. It's an old adage that words have weight, and once said they cannot simply be undone. But what if these words are untrue, insulting or damaging to a person's character, reputation or integrity? While the legal remedy of defamation certainly exists, can it really undo the injustice suffered? On today's episode, we're going to be looking at defamation in the context of the 2024 US presidential election. It's been an election campaign marked by its very personal nature, with members across the political spectrum targeting the two candidates' character, morals, and integrity. Indeed, negative campaigning has played a pivotal role in this election, with policy discussions often taking a back foot to personal attacks. To tell us more about this, I'm pleased to be joined today by Randall Stephenson. Randall is a senior researcher in the Department of Public Law, and he's recently authored a paper on the topic of defamation and the upcoming presidential election. A link to this paper, which is open access, can be found in the podcast description. Randall's kindly offered to come onto the show today and guide us through the issues at hand. So Randall, thank you so much for being here.
I really appreciate the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, lovely. We agreed that before we kind of really get going, that we should note that Randall and I are doing this on an entirely apolitical fashion. Neither of us have skin in the game. Randall hails from Canada.
Yep.
I myself are from Australia. And neither of us can vote in the upcoming US election. As such, it is going to be the Australian-Canadian connection talking today in a very much a non-partisan fashion about the laws of defamation in the US and their role in the upcoming US election. Agreed?
Agreed. Sounds good. A sensible way to start.
But it'd be great if you could kind of begin by bringing us up to speed on the laws of defamation in the US, especially what constitutes defamation.
Sure, and this would be a good opportunity to broaden the aperture, as it were, because I know in an early edition of draft of the paper that I wrote for the Verfassungsblog, I referred to the opening section as Defamation 101, and the German editors weren't quite familiar with that, and I had to tell them the 101 is usually your introductory course in university in North America, so you have Psychology 101, Sociology 101, and that interestingly enough, when you talk about U.S. defamation law, you can't do that without going back in time to the English law of defamation, because that's where it all starts. And it's a very, very critical part of the story in the later constitutionalization of defamation law by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1964. So I'd like to go back and start with defamation proper. And there's a couple interesting aspects of it that can surprise a few people, and a lot of people don't reflect on it. So defamation law purports to balance two very important but conflicting values. So on the one side, you have reputational interests and honor. The other side, you have free expression. And a lot of commentators over the years have rightly pointed out that if you were to pick one aspect of a jurisdiction's legal system to hone in on as an example of how well they've been able to balance sort of key values in a society, it would be defamation law, because it's so tricky to do this. But interestingly, what defamation, the form of doctrine that defamation law originally took is strict liability. So defamation is a strict liability tort. And what does that mean? It means that for the purposes of establish any sort of legal or evidentiary burdens, malice, falsehood, and damages are presumed. And strict liability comes literally from regulatory areas where there is an exceeding danger or risk to people. So think of hazardous waste. Think of wild animals breaking out of their fences and literally trouncing over neighboring lands. That's what we use strict liability for. So it was interesting in terms of the way they've chosen to frame defamation as a constitutive tort, is that it was thought that reputational interests were so important to protect that it was framed within a strict liability framework.
Okay, and that was back also in England when it's always been that case.
It's always been that case, and it's gone through various iterations over the centuries. But essentially, that's what makes defamation law, right from the outset, very unique, is this strict liability framework transposed from areas where you're regulating wild animals and hazardous waste to protecting reputation. So what we have then is a situation where another interesting aspect of defamation is this shifting burdens. So the first aspect, the burden is on the plaintiff. And your initial hurdle in terms of the constituent elements of a defamation action are three. You have to prove that a false defamatory statement was made. And the test for that is usually any written or spoken statement, picture, or representation that casts one into hatred, contempt, or ridicule, or lowers their reputation in the eyes of right-thinking people.
Well, the U.S. election is definitely...
So there'll be lots to unpack there.
Lot to talk about.
But the interesting thing is that that's step one. Okay. Two is it has to be published, and the courts over the years have been very liberal in that it just means to more than one person. So it's a very low threshold. Yes. The third is called the of and concerning requirement. In other words, that is defamation is a personal remedy, and the actual defamatory statement has to be made about you. It doesn't have to be intended to be that person. It can hit you inadvertently. But in order for you to recover as a personal remedy, it has to have been about you, whether intentional or not. These three constituent elements are the first hurdle and relatively easy to get over, and then the burdens shift to the defendant after that.
We've reached our three hurdles. We've taken it to court in a civil action as a plaintiff.
On a balance of probabilities, by the way. So the evidentiary standard is 50+1, more likely than not, which becomes important later for the U.S.'s actual malice rule.
Yes.
That'll come.
Okay, so and our plaintiff's taken it to court then, and we have a defendant on the other side. So the defendant has allegedly made the claim. What can the defendant then rely on, or which defences are available to say, oh, no, it's the truth? Or I made the claim, sure, but, I'm just stating facts.
Again, it's useful there to stay with the original common law defenses. So there's 4 traditional common law defenses, and they're the doctrinal aspects whereby free expression is, quote unquote, safeguarded. So we have the plaintiff side of it is very much reputationally focused. The defenses are very much more consonant with concerns with free expression. So the first one you had was what's called justification. And that doesn't have any moral connotation. It's commonly referred to as the defense of truth. And the idea is that the defendant is then put to proving that these false defamatory statements are in fact true. So defamatory, yes, but truth. And it's a complete defense under the rationale that no one deserves a reputation they don't in fact have. The difficulty with that defense is that it's notoriously difficult to prove.
I was going to say.
In court, yes.
That's, yeah.
and has been linked rightly so with a lot of concerns about chilling effect. So if you're a newspaper editor and you're meeting with your lawyers about some contentious statements about a public figure or something, a politician, or a private individual would be more appropriate in the sense of liability, concerns with liability, you have to take very seriously how far you're willing to go in terms of expense and time to prove the truth of that defamatory statement. So that's the first one. The second one is what's referred to as fair comment, which deals with matters of opinion. It's a defense to a defamatory statement if it's an opinion based upon a matter of public interest. So as long as the underlying facts are accurate and it's a position that a reasonable person knowing those facts could hold, your statements are protected. The third and fourth are variations on privilege. So the first is, I'll start with absolute privilege because most people may be more familiar with that. The thing that's privileged isn't the statements, it's the occasions on which they're made. So absolute privilege, a good example would be parliamentary privilege. So in plenary on the Commons floor, the parliamentary floor, we privilege these occasions to allow defamatory statements to be made because we feel as a matter of policy it's going to enhance and contribute to the richness
Yes,
of the political discourse, if not its defamatory nature. That would be absolute privilege. And the point is anything.
And that always exists, absolute privilege on the parliamentary floor.
Not always, but going back to, I'm going to say 1689, but I'm happy to be corrected on that. And ever since the English incorporated that as an essential part of their parliamentary proceedings, the idea is that it enhances the sort of quality and nature of political debate, so people aren't, holding their tongues by virtue of being,
concerned
about liability and subsequent punishment after the fact. The fourth is what's called qualified privilege. And the idea is usually that there is a reciprocal duty and interest in both communicating what is said and receiving it. And where that's the case, those occasions of defamatory publication are also privileged. Good example of that would be a lot of the media defamation defenses that have arisen in the last 25 years in the common law world. So starting with Australia, actually, with Langa and Australian Broadcasting Company. Yeah, in 1997, the High Court established a qualified privilege. And the idea is that in cases where the media, now here's the interesting thing. I think the original qualified privilege in Australia didn't apply to the media. But New Zealand quickly did so in 1999, and shortly there was a Langa number 1, Langa and Atkinson 1 and 2. But they established a qualified privilege for defamatory statements on political matters of political concern, where again, the idea is that the newspapers then can feel free to publish these statements to a willing audience because it's dealing with something of utmost importance, which is political discourse, especially around elections and the rest of it. So,
but they would obviously have to prove that it was actually something that did refer to political discourse and isn't purely defamatory.
Exactly. But the idea being behind that again, it's important that news organizations have some sort of other defense to rely upon than justification or truth.
Yes.
Which again creates these very rigorous problems and challenges, both with meeting the evidentiary burdens, but also litigating the costs of doing this. I mean, defamation lawsuits are always traditionally very laborious, very time-consuming, resource-intensive, and expensive, among their many other strategic concerns.
Yes, okay.
So those are essentially the four, and those are the four classic common law defenses. But as many of us in the area know, starting with the New York Times and Sullivan in 1964, and fast forward 30 years after that, you start to see a liberalization of media defamation defenses in response to this idea that the press have gone far too long without a suitable defense for them to do their job, both informing the public and also acting as a checking function in terms of an accountability function on the use of powers.
Well, we've seen more often that this has been used as a suitable defense by the press when reporting on politicians and politics in general.
I think what you find is that, especially in the 19th century in the English common law, courts being unwilling to afford the press a qualified privilege. The difficulty appears to be that you couldn't, quote unquote, shout from the rooftops defamatory, false defamatory statements in the context of political discourse, because what was apparently lacking, and was important for them doctrinally to keep, is that reciprocity of the duty, the moral duty, and the interest in the person receiving it. So courts were reluctant to open that up to the world at large. They said, you can say these things, but to designated individuals who have this reciprocal duty or interest. So that was the challenge doctrinally, which was to get courts comfortable enough with the idea that there was a legitimate policy rationale behind allowing the media to shout from the rooftops about these matters. And that's valuable. It's worth protecting. So I don't even think until the late 20th century we even get into a position where the doctrine changed enough where we see clear defamation defenses engineered to allow the press to do its job.
That gives me a nice way to move on to my next question there, freedom of speech. Free speech in America, it is the cornerstone of American society, it would seem. It's enshrined in the First Amendment. Free speech, and I guess the ability to say whatever the hell you want, to shout from the rooftops. It's the essence of America, or at least it's so one would have you believe. Definitely, that's something they really live day to day. I mean, how would you say that this has maybe shaped the United States legal and political discourse on defamation in comparison to other common law jurisdictions?
Well, I think you are cueing in on probably the two most interesting aspects of the U.S. approach to defamation, the first being the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech, and of the press. This is, interestingly, the fact that it was the First Amendment, I think ratified in 1792, it took almost 200 years for the U.S. Supreme Court to consider its application to defamation law. And this is, again, among the many interesting aspects of New York Times and Sullivan in 1964 and why it's revered so much. Professor Alexander Meiklejohn called it an occasion for dancing in the streets. And what essentially the court was struggling with is, how do the traditional strict liability, common law English principles of liability fit with the requirements of the First Amendment? And what the court unanimously held in the end was that they are inconsistent with the First Amendment. And it's interesting to get into a little bit of the debate between the majority decision and some of the concurrent decisions, because there wasn't a unanimity about what the First Amendment meant for defamation liability. So the majority decision decided upon what is called the actual malice rule, which is a heightened burden on plaintiffs in cases of defamation dealing with political officials, and later got expanded to public figures.
Right. So anyone, a Hollywood superstar.
A Richard Branson versus a Donald Trump is an example right there.
Okay.
But in the case of political officials, the plaintiff had to prove that the defamatory statement was one made of knowing falsehood or with reckless disregard as to whether it was false or not. So either you knew when you said it was false, or you were essentially reckless with whether it was. In terms of operation, what that does is, in the cases of defamatory statements dealing with public officials and later public figures, it's almost impossible, not impossible, but almost impossible to meet that burden in court, which essentially gives them effectively an absolute privilege.
Right, because the plaintiff has difficulty meeting that burden in the first place.
Correct.
So they don't even need to bring a defense against it.
Yes, that's right. It's going to fail right from the initial threshold. That's the idea. And again, remember, compare it to the traditional strict liability framework,
That's right.
where you had that easy initial hurdle.
Yes.
This becomes almost an insurmountable one.
And this is the malice?
Actual malice rule.
Okay, right.
And the interesting thing about that is, for me anyway, as a scholar, is when you actually unpack the reasoning in New York Times and Sullivan, Justice Hugo Black, who wrote in a very interesting concurring opinion, he was a free speech absolutist. The First Amendment says, make no law, nothing. So he thought the only credible interpretation of the First Amendment for defamation law was an absolute privilege. Now, that didn't win the day. And in some respects, it's useful to think of defamation law along a continuum of, say, on the left, protection of reputation, and on the right, protection of free expression.
Yes.
And you have all these intermediate areas where you can adopt doctrinal approaches that fit in that continuum. And of course, when you look at the strict liability framework originally, it's very much pushed towards the protection of reputation. An absolute privilege, as Hugo Black wanted, would have been all the way to the other end. And the actual malice rule is somewhere in there.
Okay,
From the extreme.
More towards
the free expression, certainly, absolutely. But certainly leaving enough of a delta there where it was concerning enough for Hugo Black, Justice Black, to say, I don't think, number one, that that's a persuasive interpretation of the First Amendment itself, but what it necessarily means for defamation doctrine. So that's the first major thing. And then the second thing, of course, is the constitutionalization of defamation law due to New York Times and Sullivan, which we've talked about. And I think those two things, at least since 1964, distanced America from the rest of the common law world for at least a generation or two.
Okay. This push towards free speech, freedom.
Correct.
Okay.
And also, don't forget, too, much more pro-media. So the defendant in Sullivan was New York Times, which was faced with a very, very substantial damage award from the Alabama Supreme Court. I think it was, at the time, $500,000 US, which would be roughly analogous to $4 million US today. I mean, when you start defending multiple defamation suits and being on the hook for that kind of financial liability,
quickly adds up.
Exactly, quickly adds up, and it's not too far a reach to see how that can have a chilling effect on you doing your job. So yeah, I think those would be the two main aspects that distinguish, at least historically, the U.S.'s approach to defamation liability.
We're on the US now, so let's stay there. I guess we get to the nub of today's podcast. We've kind of gotten a background now to defamation law, particularly so now in the United States. Let's turn to the 2024 presidential election. Is it fair to say that Donald Trump has embraced the art of defamation into his political playbook? And if so, what has the Democratic Party's response been?
Interesting juxtaposition of questions. I would say the first thing to note about Donald Trump is he's been long calling for the repeal of New York Times and Sullivan, interestingly. So he doesn't like it when defamatory statements are made about himself and are protected under the actual malice rule, but is seemingly quick to
dish out,
as it were, which is interesting. And I guess it's no mystery or no secret that both in terms of former President Trump's views about New York Times and Sullivan and his record, especially on social media and dishing it out. In terms of the Democratic Party's response, well, first of all, I wouldn't be in a position to know exactly, but when I take a look at all the various lawsuits that former President Trump is defending right now, including multiple defamation lawsuits, I think what is most interesting is that for someone as well-resourced as he is in terms of his political connections and capital, his wealth. Say what you will about the difficulties of defending defamation actions. I think the way that you get to him more is through criminal liability. And what I've been shocked at is the sheer number of criminal indictments that he's been defending and convicted of this year. I mean, I think there was 34 felony convictions in May. Making him the first former president to be convicted of a felony. I think that's probably strategically, if I had to guess, where the Democratic Party would feel like it can make the most headway in terms of upsetting his candidacy and disturbing the momentum and progress. Not to say that the defamation suits aren't themselves very disruptive, especially from a reputational standpoint. But then again, he almost seems to be a bit of a Teflon-coated defendant in this sense, in that his own constituency doesn't seem to be particularly bothered by a lot of the nature of the reputational claims and issues in the defamation suit. So I would say probably the thing that's most conspicuous is the sheer number of criminal charges that have been levied against him in the last 12 months.
Okay, and that's what more the Democratic Party was possibly, or is trying to focus on rather than, and is saying, all right, there's so many quotes coming out and posts and that it's like, well.
And there's other reasons, too, we can discuss about the sort of limitations of defamation lawsuits within the political discursive realm, especially when you're dealing with parties to the defamation disputes that are public officials, that are public figures. This makes it exceedingly difficult to be suited in defamation from the outset.
The clock is ticking, right? I mean, the election's coming up one way or another. So maybe it's not worth spending time, effort, resources in courts when you can maybe fight that campaign elsewhere amongst the constituents.
Exactly. And I think that's a good point, too, about bringing up about the importance of strategy. I mean, as a younger litigation associate dealing with defamation claims, it was interesting to me that most of the senior bar would always recommend self-help remedies to their clients, is stay out of the courts. These can be nasty and drawn-out affairs where you do have the reputational sensitivities at risk, of course, but also very unique, long, drawn-out trials, very expensive, high legal costs, uncertain outcomes, and then getting to the point you mentioned at the outset of this when you said, does this necessarily create a good result at the end of the day in terms of defamation? Most often not. You end up exacerbating the reputational issues, the sensitivities.
Keeping them alive for longer, I guess.
Exactly. You completely obliterate your coffers in terms of feeding the lawyers and paying their legal fees. And so it's always a very sophisticated calculation that has to go into whether you do sue for defamation, what your likely prospects are, and what you're willing to pay for it.
We're going to come back to that after this short break with Randall. We're going to talk more about defamation and focus in on a few particular incidents in the upcoming presidential election. You're listening to Doing Time, Talking Crime, a podcast by the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Crime, Security and Law. All right, well, welcome back to Doing Time, Talking Crime. I'm joined today by Randall Stephenson. Randall, before the break, we talked a little bit about Donald Trump and his defamation playbook, if you will. In preparing for this episode, and I must say, I did enjoy preparing for this episode. It's very factual, very on point. It's topical, you know. I came across the fact that Donald Trump habitually calls his political opponents certain names. I have heard it somewhat in Australian politics, but nowhere near on the level that we've seen here. I mean, we had for Joe Biden, we had Sleepy Joe or Crooked Joe. Kamala Harris, we had Crazy Kamala or Comrade Kamala, alleging that she's a communist. Tim Walz, the governor of Minnesota, being referred to as Tampon Tim for the fact that he installed tampon vending machines in restrooms in Minnesota. And for Stormy Daniels, we had Horseface. She also had some pretty choice words to say about Donald Trump, which you can all remember. That was probably one defamation case that did go for some time in the media. But are these just childish quips, or is there more to it than this?
This brings up an interesting issue, and you mentioned preparing for this. I had to go back over this sort of thing myself in terms of the general principles to refresh my understanding of these seemingly simple issues, because these things come up all the time.
It's just name calling.
Name calling.
That's right, yeah.
But I think that the most accurate way to respond is to say that defamation is not a statement of opinion. So that name calling per se, conventionally understood, and the examples that you gave, for example, is not actionable as defamation. So recall again with the classic defenses to a defamation action, when you have fair comment dealing with a matter of statements of opinion on matters of public interest. When you start using names like Crazy Kamala and Horseface and Tampon Tim and all these other admittedly childish and puerile references, you'd be hard-pressed to suggest that they're factual statements. And I think it's precisely because of that sort of close to the boundary assessment that they invite, which is why traditionally they're not actionable. And I'll bet former President Trump's lawyers have advised him very carefully on this and probably feels fairly comfortable in making these sorts of statements. Now, whether in fact they're at all effective discursively, it remains to be seen. I guess you could make a case either way, but it certainly promotes a rather uncivil approach to political discourse.
That's right.
And perhaps we could expect a little better than that.
Yes, yeah. I was looking through trying to find the list of names. It was quite long. From his friends as well. He's got names and nicknames for them, but there was a very long list of nicknames.
You could probably spend many a week compiling a list.
That's right. Nicknames, sticks and stones will break my bones, but names will never hurt me. I mean, that's, all right, we can agree that no one's going to take that to court. That being called Horseface, you're not going to take that as a plaintiff to court and expect a win. What, though, about this election I found somewhat disturbing has been the overt sexualization and the claims, particularly by not so much Donald Trump. I think he was more involved in retweeting certain posts and the like from his supporters. Plenty of supporters who've gone on record on national TV making sexual slurs against Kamala Harris, saying that she provides sexual favors to colleagues and that she has slept her way to the top of the Democratic ticket. I mean, for me, this seems to go beyond simply calling her Crazy Kamala. I mean, this is a far more personal attack. I mean, where is this all going?
Well, here I think you bring up a very instructive example, because I think your instincts about this going further than Horseface or these types of quips is certainly true. This is where, on the face of it, I think you have, in many such cases, a clear meeting of the test for a defamatory statement. But then again, this gets to the sort of importance of the sort of behind-the-scenes strategizing and strategy that must, I think, always go alongside your pursuit of, or your consideration of pursuing, a defamation action. Think about a case where you're dealing with issues about, in terms of your sexual private life and all the rest of it. Is this something that you want to actually have put through a court process in any way, shape, or form? I could imagine people saying any right-thinking person in society is going to consider the source, hear this kind of statement, and just give them the rope they need to hang themselves, so to speak. So I think, again, this really does speak to the importance of being very careful about whether and how you go about pursuing any sort of remedy for these sorts of threats to your reputational interests, and whether a defamation suit on balance makes sense given what's at stake, both short-term and long-term. I think, again, to be clear, where you're dealing with statements, again, remember the original definition where you're talking about a defamatory statement. I think clearly in these sorts of cases it's met. Publication, sure. I mean, it's going through social media most of the time, right? Of and concerning, yes, it's clear as day who it's meant to hit.
It's meant to concern, that's right.
That's right. The difficulty also might be, though, insofar as we're dealing with political officials again and public figures, you have the elevated burden of the actual malice rule. Not to say that under a certain factual situation and in a certain context, you wouldn't succeed. But again, at what cost? That's the thing that for me, for defamation, if I took anything from litigating in the area, it was always ask yourself before you start a lawsuit, at what cost? What are you willing to pay? This goes back full circle with your introduction again. What just result, if any?
That's right, if any. Can
you expect and achieve? Yeah. And I think probably the more senior defamation counsel might be a little more, they will hedge their bets more and be a little more honest about the disruptive effects that it can have, the sort of deleterious effects it can have, and the amplifying effects it can have of keeping these sort of things in the media. I mean, these are public processes. It's a very interesting counterpoint to the sort of quips and name-calling, because, again, you are dealing with clearly defamatory statements. And the fact that we don't see them pursued as often as they are, I think, speaks to the importance of these background strategic concerns that are always baked in to whether you should pursue a defamation action at all.
Okay. Well, someone who does pursue defamation actions of late has been Donald Trump. I mean, we're going to kind of look on the other side of the coin now, and he has initiated a range of proceedings against numerous journalists for defamation. We talked before the show a little bit about the defamation case he has running against the ABC network at the moment. I was wondering if you could go into that in a little more detail, and also to say what the challenges are for journalists when reporting on public figures, because obviously in certain situations they can also overstep a line.
The lawsuit you're referring to is originated out of an interview that George Stephanopoulos gave with South Carolina Congresswoman Nancy Mace on the 10th of March, I believe. And I watched it recently. It's about 7 minutes or so long. Very difficult to get through because of the nature of the accusations and particularly the issues that were being discussed. Congresswoman Mace had very courageously, publicly spoke about her being a victim of rape earlier on in her life. And when she endorsed Trump for the presidential nomination, George Stephanopoulos put that question to her about, well, as a former victim, how do you feel, how could you explain about voting for Trump? Understandably, the conversation got very intense, very combative, not a lot of listening was going on both sides. And during the course of the interview, George Stephanopoulos said at least 3 times that I was aware of that Trump had been found liable for rape. And in the context of the lawsuits that he was referring to, that is a factually incorrect statement. Now, there has been some suggestion that Mr. Stephanopoulos knew that to be the case. And if that can be proven in court, it might satisfy the actual malice's burden of showing under clear and convincing evidence that he knew what he was stating was either false or he was showing reckless disregard for its truth or falsity. Now, having said that, for me, it's a lesson about how careful everyone has to be, because you can't hide behind the actual malice rule and say, well, I can just, anything goes, even with speaking about public officials and public figures. Okay. There can be situations, and it remains to be seen whether there's sufficient evidence to make out this case. But at least on the face of it, a lot of commentators in the media have been suggesting that unlike Trump's appallingly poor record as a plaintiff in defamation suits, this might be one of the first cases where he has a legitimate chance of succeeding. Okay.
And would that then shake up the media world? I mean, we're saying, was it New York Times and Sullivan? Yeah. Yeah. Something that would be along those lines, a change where we see, or not so much so?
What it would be is a wake-up call for journalists and everyone to be careful about their discourse. It would be laced with multiple layers of irony, and that it would be Trump winning, especially given his past track record on these very issues. But nevertheless, these cases are decided almost entirely on the evidence adduced at court, and there is at least a legitimate chance that this one might succeed in the end. Again, I would just say it to me would be a wake-up call and a reminder for people to, as much as you don't like the individual, in this case Trump, you still have to be careful and a little mindful about where the limits are of acceptable speech. They are, as you know, in the American political context, quite broad. So
yes, that's right. Well, I'd like to now leave the topic of defamation behind, at least briefly, and turn to fake news, which apparently isn't as new a concept as I originally thought.
Yeah, it's interesting because the term itself is usually associated with Word of the Year, I think, in 2017 or
yeah, that's
whatever.
right. It seemed to be the previous, when Donald Trump won the election, that was where he really became president of the US. That was where fake news kind of hit the news.
I don't think he could resist the temptation of claiming that he coined the term himself. But in fact, when you go back, I've done a little research on this in the context of another project. And in terms of the history of fake news, two small little anecdotes. The first being we found the first statute on the books from 1275 that made it an offense to spread the devisers of false tales. Was interesting. So right there you have, just shortly after the Magna Carta, you have a statutory enactment against fake news. And then, interestingly, even in America's own history, so during the very hotly contested presidential election in 1800, I believe it was President Adams's supporters, particularly newspapers that were supporting Federalist newspapers, that were spreading intentional lies of Thomas Jefferson's death in order to alter the electoral outcome. So this idea that we...
Don't vote for him.
He's no longer here. So this idea that we live in a uniquely hotly contested political environment, while that may ultimately be so, there's certainly periods in American history, going back to as early as its Federalist era, showing that these things are at least not in and of themselves unique. So, yeah.
Oh, gosh. Dead presidents, horse faces, it's all here. Would you say, you said the first laws were back in England there, 13th century, 12th century. The media landscape has obviously changed, though, significantly. The way in which stories are written, the way in which stories are consumed has changed dramatically. Are the laws, as they stand, still fit for their current purpose? I mean, I was just thinking of things like, it's clear, well, it's not necessarily clear, but there's cases of defamation which one could bring, but one avoids them because it's just so long-winded, it's going, why would I even want to? Does that mean the laws then are no longer effective, and do they need to be updated?
I think this is the most topical issue that I think public libel law faces in this generation, which is two U.S. Supreme Court justices in particular, Neil Gorsuch and Clarence Thomas, have written very interesting dissents as of late, questioning whether it's time for New York Times and Sullivan to be rethought. And the concern seems to be, exactly as you stated, that the digital media ecology has changed so drastically in the last generation and created such unforeseen issues and challenges that it is no longer fit for task. And as far as I can tell, a particular concern seems to be combating misinformation. So Justice Gorsuch in particular, I think, has rightly shed light on the issue that unless we have some sort of basic epistemic basis that we can all agree upon in terms of the brute facts that we encounter in this world, we can't discharge our responsibilities as democratic citizens. And the danger I find in this, and this gets back to the sort of thesis in the Verfassungsblog article that I wrote, which is that there's a real danger that pulling on the thread of New York Times and Sullivan to address issues of misinformation and disinformation is a little too short-sighted and crude. And by that, I mean that an aspect of free expression that is commonly overlooked. So free expression is generally supported by three justifications, which is the truth-seeking. It helps us to discover truth and ferret out falsehoods. Autonomy, it's an important aspect of being a human being, to have the freedom of conscience and to be able to speak publicly about it and share your views. And the third being democratic self-governance. Thomas Jefferson himself once wrote in 1787 to Edward Carrington, if I could have government without newspapers or newspapers without government, I wouldn't hesitate a moment to pick the latter. And what this captured was what they called the checking function of the press. This goes back to a great professor that I had at Columbia, Professor Vincent Blasi, who wrote a fantastic article on this in 1977 in the American Bar Foundation Research Journal. But his whole point was, somewhere along the line, this checking function of the press, this idea of the watchdog function in more popular nomenclature, is that it's been missed, it's been lost, it's been kind of faded into obscurity. Well, here's the thing. The concern with a proposal such as Justices Gorsuch and Thomas are suggesting is that it underestimates the importance that New York Times and Sullivan does in upholding that checking function. If we relax New York Times and Sullivan and pull it closer to the pole that protects reputational interests, we're going to be, whether intentionally or not, inhibiting the press's ability to do its job. So my worry is that, yes, misinformation is a problem, but the solution probably isn't as simple as yanking on that thread of the tapestry and hoping. It probably will end up doing more harm than good. And at least it's worth, I mean, to be fair, Justice Gorsuch's dissent in Berisha and Lawson in particular is so thoughtful, and it's so more open-ended about, well, what about this and what about this and what does rethinking this mean? As long as it's engaged in a truly exploratory, open-ended way, I have faith that the right decision will be made. But if it's a reaction against New York Times and Sullivan in the way that Donald Trump has always opposed New York Times and Sullivan, which is, it's okay for me to say what I want, but when it hurts on the other end, I want to be able to go after the newspaper organizations, then we have a problem. So I think in answer to your question, it's a very complicated problem. It's very much a product of how little we even understand about the vulnerabilities and nature of our own digital media ecology. And working out old, analog, pre-digital legal principles and rules to fit our new media ecology is going to be one of the most difficult challenges, I think, in the 21st century.
Randall, thank you so much for coming on to the Look.
Hey, thanks for the time. I really had a lot of fun, number one.
Absolutely.
I really appreciate it.
Really enjoyed it as well. Thank you so much. And as I say, your article is available there. We'll link it in the podcast.
Yeah.
Let's see, what is it, 4 weeks, 6 weeks? Yeah, maybe 5 weeks until the election. So let's see what happens in the meantime.
Yeah, hold on. We need ticket ride, I'm sure.
That's right. All right. Thank you, Randall.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you'd like to listen to additional podcasts or learn more about our research, visit us at csl.mpg.de.